So if anybody is near the doors at the back, perhaps you can close the doors. It makes the acoustics a little bit better. Thank you very much. So welcome everyone to this evening's lecture by Professor Leah Ippy. The lecture is part, I hear an echo here, is that going to be recorded, the echo?
It would be.
It would be.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start again. Welcome everyone to this evening's lecture by Professor Leah Ippy. The lecture is part of a series hosted by the Royal Institute of Philosophy in the UK and UCD School of Philosophy. The first lecture in the series, in the cooperative series, was delivered by Martha Nussbaum in 2018. The second lecture was delivered in 2019 by Elizabeth Anderson, and the third on Zoom due to the pandemic in 2021 by Axel Honneth. And today we have the great pleasure of hearing Leah Ippy talk to us. I'd like to thank the Royal Institute of Philosophy, in particular the current coordinator of the lecture series, Professor Harcourt, and also Anissa Al-Jambari, who has done most of the assistant organizer, who has done most of the on-the-ground organising on the UK side. I'd like to thank UCD School of Philosophy, in particular the current head of school, Professor Roland Stout, who's been very supportive of the event, Helena McCann, school administrator, and Gillian Johnson, school manager, who together have done most of the on-the-ground organising on the Ireland side. And finally, I want to express our gratitude to Rainier Abengana, PhD candidate, who has provided invaluable assistance with the IT equipment. Professor Ippy is Professor of Political Theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and an honorary professor in philosophy at the Australian National University. A native of Albania, she has degrees in philosophy and in literature from the University of Rome, La Sapienza, a PhD from the European University Institute, and she was a postdoctoral prize research fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. She is the author of several books published by Oxford University Press and numerous scholarly articles in leading journals. She's been awarded the British Academy Prize for Excellence in Political Science and the Leverhulme Prize for Outstanding Research Achievement. Her philosophical memoir, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, which appears with Penguin Books in 2021, has won several international prizes and is being translated into more than 20 languages. Google tells me that the British magazine Prospect has recently named her as one of the world's top 10 thinkers, and the German Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, very serious German newspaper, regards her as one of the most important contemporary cultural figures. I've known Leah Ippy and her work for quite some time. I've always been struck by her elegant treatments of classic questions in liberal political theory from a critical Marxist vantage point that shows a deep understanding of Marxist thinking. I am thinking here, for example, of her article, Political Legitimacy in Marxist Perspective, which appeared in the European Journal of Political Theory in 2020. I've always been impressed, too, by her knowledge and appreciation of European intellectual history, which enables her to show some, at times, unlikely affinities, for example, between Kant and Marx. I'm thinking here, in particular, of her 2014 essay entitled On Revolution in Kant and Marx. However, up to last year, I knew virtually nothing about Leah's biography. Her book, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, opens with a vivid description of Leah, aged 10 or 11, embracing a bronze statue of Stalin in the gardens of the Palace of Culture in Tirana, where she grew up. In one way, this opening image surprised and disturbed me. But in another way, it didn't surprise me at all. And the book, which you should read if you haven't already done so, will tell you why it's no cause for surprise. I highly recommend this wonderful memoir to you, but I also recommend her scholarly writings. Her lecture tonight is entitled For a Critical History of Philosophy. And please join me in welcoming Leah Uppy to UCD.
Thank you very much, Maeve, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's a great pleasure to be here. So the title of the lecture is For a Critical Philosophy of History, and the lecture is part of a larger project, in part connected to what Maeve was just mentioning, which is an effort to revive and rethink the links between Kant's philosophy and Marx's philosophy on a number of issues. But today I'm not going to talk about either Kant or Marx. I'm going to talk about the most controversial topic that is often connected to the philosophy of history, and to, in some ways, what has given philosophy of history a bad name in recent contemporary philosophy, which is the question of progress. Progress is both a necessary and a dangerous idea. It's dangerous because it has often given rise to instances of colonialism, paternalism, domination of people outside the core Western European countries, all took place in the name of progress. But it's also a necessary idea if one is trying to improve the way things are, because without a belief in progress, our efforts to do the right thing would have very little orientation. And so what the project really tries to do is to come up with a more critical account of progress, and connected to that with also a more critical account of the philosophy of history, which is needed when we think about the question of progress. And today I'm going to talk about only one part of this larger question around progress, which is the question of political progress, and to try and defend or give some orientation on how and in what direction we need to go when we're thinking about the idea of progress, a defense of the idea of progress, and how to think critically about that idea. I'm going to start by distinguishing between moral and political progress, and I will tell you a little bit more about where I'm coming from in thinking about political progress, which is somewhat analogous to how I think also about moral progress. And I'm going to suggest that we make political progress not when we approximate an ideal that is always already known to us, but when our engagement with history and with our contemporary practices reflect what we learn from the mistakes of the past. And so it's a trial and error. And to outline how that process of moral learning takes place and how it then reflects on our political efforts, I'm going to connect to an idea, which is the idea of justice, that's very prominent in contemporary political theory, but think about how we can reflect on norms of justice in a way that is more critically, more historically informed and critically nuanced. So before I do that, let me start with two general questions. The first one, what does it mean to believe in progress? What does it mean to say that there has to be some postulate around the possibility of political progress that informs our thinking about history and about politics more generally? And I think to defend that idea and to think about what the postulate of progress means, we need to locate it as a propositional attitude between two extremes. So the first one is the idea that progress is not impossible. That's one extreme. And that seems plausible, but it's almost trivial, because to say that progress is impossible, it seems just as dogmatic as to say that progress is necessary. And when we say that progress is not impossible, what we're really saying is that we can't know. And the alternative, the one that says that progress is impossible, commits the objector to this form of prophetic theorizing about the future, which is exactly what we worry when we worry about assumptions on progress that we make. That form of theorizing seems to predict a future course of events by saying that progress is impossible, and is not really in a position to give us evidence for that prediction, because those events that are being predicted haven't really taken place yet. So to say that, to defend the postulate of progress is to say a little bit more than progress is not impossible. The second is the other extreme, and that's to say that progress is necessary. And that's too strong for the reasons that the alternative that I just mentioned earlier is weak. In arguing the case, we seem to misunderstand the nature of the agent that is responsible for making progress and for directing their action in compatibility with certain norms. And again, that form of belief about progress does seem to commit us to what Kant called prophetic theorizing about the future. It predicts events without really knowing about what direction they will take. And as Kant says, that kind of prophetic theorizing about the future would only be plausible if the prophet were able to realize the events that the prophet is foretelling. And so if one had this capacity to both predict the future, but also to predict the kinds of things that we are committed to doing. And in some ways, moral beliefs and moral agency are like that. So we are in some ways making promissory notes about ourselves and how we're going to behave morally. But of course, we're not just moral agents, we're flawed agents, and we're limited by circumstances, by our lives, by the history that we're thrown into. And so we could only predict a prophet that does the kinds of things that the prophet is committed to from a moral perspective. And we can only say that that's necessarily going to happen only if we could ascribe to people an unlimited goodwill, and if we could abstract from all the constraints on their agency and from all their obstacles to the realization of these moral norms. And of course, we can't know in advance what motives people have and what obstacles will emerge and how they will interact with other people. So to believe in progress is to say a little bit more than progress is not impossible, but it's to say a little bit less than progress is necessary. And so here I want to defend the idea that to answer the problem of whether the belief in progress is plausible, we need a kind of shift in perspective. And we need to focus on moral agency as it expresses itself through historical, moral, and political institutions, and to be able to tell a story about those institutions that then contributes to a wider account of progress in this critical philosophy of history way that I have just outlined. And so we need to think about social and political institutions as they promote or hinder that progress. We need to explore history, not just as an aggregate of events and characters, but as a philosophical history, as history with a kind of moral direction, as conjectural history, the kind of history that people in the Enlightenment thought about and wrote about when they thought about history and about the philosophy of history. So we need to explore it as if we were looking at a normatively integrated, morally purposeful system, and one that integrates with this moral orientation, character, events, moral norms, and so on. So I'm going to do just that, but I'm not going to focus on history and on everything. So morality, the history of morality as well. I'm just going to focus on political progress. And I'm going to now say a little bit more about why and how political progress is distinctive. So I'm going to focus on norms of justice as the norms that are distinctively connected to political progress. And I'm going to inform this account and this defense of progress and place it situated in a philosophical tradition, which is the pragmatist philosophical literature in reflecting on moral agency, by trying to tease out the distinctive perspective on politics that can be connected to that pragmatic literature on moral agency. And that's because in some ways, the idea that human beings make moral progress as they try and solve problems, as they deal with the circumstances of their lives, is familiar from that philosophically pragmatic literature. And so I'm not going to defend pragmatism either in general or in any particular version of it, but just try to reflect on the relationship between this topic that is central to pragmatist literature, moral progress, and the other topic which I think has received much less attention, which is the topic of political progress, and try and think in conversation, putting in conversation the perspective on political progress to that on moral progress, try and come out with a more distinctive account of what we mean when we think about political progress and how we can defend the idea of political progress. So, and my aim is to, as I say, to try and to explain the similarities and the differences between the concepts of moral and political progress, and to account and to defend an account of political progress which is centered on the evolution of justice-based norms. So let me start with the idea of moral progress, and then I will move into political progress more specifically. When we think about moral progress, one way of making sense of it is to think about the kinds of things that have discredited the idea of progress, and with which I started at the beginning, this idea of philosophy of history and this teleological march of in history that is almost necessary in its move, and that has given the philosophy of history a bad name because it's invoked this necessary progressive march of humanity. And that idea has often been seen as, on the one hand, necessary to motivate moral action, but is also exactly also what's connected with this idea that we know we're on the right side of history, and therefore we can impose certain views on institutions and politics to other countries that don't share, other places or other cultures that don't share this idea. And that's what makes it dangerous as well. And that's what exactly triggered the connection to these discourses of civilizational superiority or of domination, of paternalism and oppression. Another way of thinking about moral progress is to think of it as a process of functional refinement of moral norms. So function statements are familiar in the philosophy of biology. They're a common place to discuss the function of a particular organ in terms of the development of how it contributes to that, to the working of that particular organ. So people will say things like human beings have hearts so that they can pump blood. And that's where a function is described as a property or a set of properties that explains the existence and the preservation of a particular trait in a given population through evolutionary mechanisms as a response to a particular problem in that development. And so lots of authors try to extend that account from biology and from the use of function statements in biology to thinking about morality, and to consider morality as a kind of social technology, which is a term that I'm personally averse to, but it gives you the idea that we think of morality as solving certain kinds of problems. And the function of ethics on that account is to remedy altruism failures. And there's different ways of thinking about this and caching the account and so on, but vaguely, broadly, this is what authors like Philip Kitcher, for example, have in mind when they think about moral progress in this philosophically pragmatic literature. And there are objections to that account, but I'm not going to go into the objections because I'm broadly sympathetic to the method. And I want to try and refocus the conversation on the related but distinctive topic of political progress. And I'm going to assume somehow that it's plausible to think about function statements and to think about development and evolution of norms in this way, and to also assume that it's plausible to think about morality in this way. But what I'm going to do is to try and think about, okay, what does politics do? What is distinctive about politics that doesn't appear in this conversation around moral norms and the functional refinement of moral norms? And we are accustomed to thinking that what makes political theory a distinctive, though connected realm of inquiry to moral philosophy is that even if we assume that people have somehow managed to overcome these altruism failures or overcome the problems of coordination with regard to moral problems, from an individual perspective, there are supplementary concerns that arise when we think about politics in its relationship to morality. And one of them is the question of assurance. So even if we assume that everyone does the right thing, that we have somehow solved our coordination problem from a moral individual perspective, there is a broader question of how can we be assured that everyone else will also do what is right or what we think is the right thing to do. So I'm going to call that the problem of political coordination. And the second question is what we might call the question of continuity. So even if we have resolved the problem of coordination, how do we know that what we have constructed at one particular point in time between one particular group is going to continue to be reproduced in time and maintained in that mechanism? And without somehow losing the kinds of benefits that that mechanism of coordination had initially conferred on us. So that we'll call that problem of continuity, which has to do with the temporal transfer of norms. So one has to do with how we coordinate norms in a collective and how we can assure each other of the fact that everybody will do the right thing. And the second one is, even if we find out a way of doing the right thing collectively, how do we make sure that we don't lose that once we have it and that we can reproduce it in from a temporal perspective, in a historical perspective. And of course, the story that follows from this, and that we find in all the big classics of political thought, from Plato to Machiavelli, from Hobbes to Rousseau, from Hegel to Rawls, via Kant, political institutions exert collective authority, and they are required to ensure this coordinated and continuous form of cooperation between human beings. And that form of collective authority is effective if it can combine and if it can condition the development of human practices through a combination of punishing sanctions on the one hand and rules that discipline us, so what we call power. We need power to make sure that we overcome the limits of altruistic norms and dispositions, even if we concede that altruistic norms and dispositions are essential to recognize the need for power. But the replication, the generation and the replication of political rule through the exercise of power is different from the generation of moral norms through voluntary efforts. And that seems to make politics a distinctive realm of inquiry compared to moral philosophy and moral action. So if we think about moral progress as a kind of progress that captures the functional refinement of altruistic dispositions, the functional refinement of moral norms, it might be plausible, and that's my suggestion, to think of political progress in this analogous way to the idea of moral progress, and to think of it as the process of refinement of a different kind of norm, which is required to address these two problems of coordination and continuity, and that is justice-based norms. So we think of political progress as progress that refines justice-based norms. So why justice? Justice, it's often said, is the first virtue of social institutions. And whether that has always been the case or whether its prominence in our system reflects our contingent way of being in the world now, and so the values that we find important and the hierarchy of these values isn't really relevant. I'll return to this question when I discuss some objections to my account. Justice is important because norms of justice help us reflect on the way in which exercises of power should be regulated. And justice is what enables us to ask questions around who is power addressed to, who exercises power, on whom, for what reasons, and through what means. So norms of justice seem to play in the political realm an analogous role to what moral norms play in the interpersonal realm. Moral norms help us establish how people ought to relate to each other from a moral perspective, and norms of justice help us establish how power holds us together and with what reasons and through what means we can then coordinate and reflect on the continuation of political norms from this distinctive political perspective. So justice is what helps us answer the question of what kind of collective authority do we need to exercise power in the presence of conflicts around power and in the presence of the problems of coordination and continuity that I've just mentioned. So if we think about ethical progress, moral progress as a process of ethical refinement that thinks about norms that emerge, moral norms that emerge that are more and more appropriate to resolve coordination questions in the moral realm, it's plausible to think of justice as something that does something similar, and the function of justice as that which needs to be functionally refined when we're thinking about regulation of relations in this political realm where interpersonal relations are mediated by the exercise of power. So the nature of the problems is going to be different at different times and different places, but it's plausible to think that people will, in the course of struggling with the problems, with the conflicts of their lives, that they will come up with different interpretations of what power is, who should exercise it, through what means, and with what reasons. So the question for political progress, and the question that anyone needs to answer who is defending or trying to defend the idea of political progress, is how can we tell which of these refinements of justice is progressive and which one is regressive? So how can we think about the functional refinement of norms of justice in a way that enables us to say, well, when something is done in the right way and responds to problems in the right way, that is a progressive transition, and when it doesn't, it's a regressive transition. And what are the criteria that we can think of when we're trying to come up with an account of the functional refinement of justice-based norms? So one way, and this is where I'm going to try and say something briefly now, one way to answer this question of how we can speak of a progressive refinement, what counts as a progressive refinement in the function of justice, is to think of the process of developing justice-based norms as the process of discovery of appropriate political and institutional responses to the concerns and the commitments of the people who are subjected to power. So there's a group people against whom power is exercised. And we don't need to think of that process as always peaceful or as peaceful from the start. And we don't need to think of it as a process mediated by reason giving. And we also don't have to think of it as a linear process that occurs without any lapses, and that once we have a progressive, what we might call a progressive transition, there is no possibility of going back and having a regressive moment after a progressive transition. And you'll see what I mean with this when I hopefully give you a few examples in the second part of the talk. So the emergence of different principles of justice and the emergence of the different schemes through which we regulate our political relations can come out of a variety of factors. It doesn't have to come out of reason giving, or it doesn't have to assume that this process is rational to begin with. It can come out of constraints that are there, that are material, that have to do with circumstances, that have to do with the fact that one group has brutally managed to impose their will on another group by sheer coercion and oppression. It can be abolition of previously oppressive institutions by a group of Enlightenment resistance movements, for example. It can be a catastrophic climate event or environmental change that also triggers. So it can have a variety of sources. The genealogy of different forms of rules is varied, and we have plenty of evidence of that historically. But the point of reflecting on political progress as a process of refinement of justice-based norms is that we can think critically about all these different stories about how norms emerge and how political rule becomes consolidated, and that we can think about them by reflecting on the criteria, as I mentioned, of what is it that we can learn from the past. So how can we transfer what we know about forms of rule in the past and about the functional refinement of norms of justice in the past? How can we deploy that knowledge about the past to think about the institutions of the present, such that we can track, or say we are not able to track, a progressive transition, such that we can detect what counts as a progressive transition? Okay, so I'm going to suggest that it's possible to think about the way in which political institutions exercise power in this fallibilist way. And that's the method that needs to orient us when we're thinking about how can we tell a progressive transition from a regressive transition, is to reflect on the contribution of views around justice to the process of refinement of justice-based norms, with what I think are three criteria that we can borrow from the way in which in philosophy of science we think about whether a theory is appropriate or not to reflect on the world. And I'm going to call this criteria a diagnostic criteria, a heuristic criteria, and an innovating criterion. And I'm going to say a little bit more about with each of these criteria. So the first one is a diagnostic criterion. So a family or an interpretation or a family of interpretations that tries to track how political institutions respond to the concerns and commitments and to the way in which power is exercised on a political group is more persuasive than rival alternatives when it diagnoses the grounds of a conflict in the right way, when it gives us the right diagnosis. So it kind of gets at the fundamentally appropriate level of analysis. The theory captures enough conflicts in the world that it can give us an account of these conflicts that is fundamentally appropriate in that it can go to the heart of the causes of that conflict, what's really triggering it. The second, which I call the innovating criterion, is to say that a theory or a family of theories of justice is innovating over an alternative, a rival alternative theory of justice, when it's able to identify normative principles about how power should be exercised that preserve the benefits of its predecessors but can avoid their pitfalls. And again, I'm going to give you an example in a minute. And as far as the third is concerned, so the heuristic one, a family of theories contains heuristic potential when its combination of innovation with conceptual categories for diagnosing the kinds of conflicts that we face also has some guidelines for thinking about new anticipated conflicts. So has a sense in which what might go out, what is left out of the theory here, what might go wrong, what new conflicts might emerge after we've applied these criteria, these norms of justice. So it seems to me that this is a very general methodological approach, as I say, coming out of fallibilist philosophy of science, that might help us think about refinement of justice-based norms along those three criteria, where we would say that in any particular context of the justification of political norms, we can identify the principles that enable these basic functions of political institutions, that is to say, the exercise of power, to be discharged by reflecting on the structure of social roles and how the institutions respond to the concerns and commitments of the agents on whom power is exercised. And we can do that by observing challenges to these systems in thinking about the kinds of conflicts that existing norms of justice are unable to capture. And the claim is that a progressive normative view or a family of views is one that contributes to revising and to modifying the existing principles of justice so that the function of political norms is discharged by institutions in a way that preserve the benefits of their predecessors but can avoid their failures. And a normative view is regressive if it doesn't do that. So all of that, I think, helps to clarify how we can think from a methodological perspective on using fallibilism to think about norms of justice and how particular social and political institutions discharge certain normative functions on the one hand. Then we can examine the appropriateness of the different interpretations that we have in discharging these normative functions, and so whether they contribute or not to this functional refinement. And we can also use this theory to assess the kinds of challenges that the theory encounters on the ground and the kinds of principles that it gives rise to. So how are we in which we live, and then we ask whether the conceptions of justice that they have are more or less adequate to contribute to the functional refinement of the norms of justice. So the way in which we construct our assessment, I think, has to be connected to the way to the claims of social and political movements on the ground who are trying to tell us that there's something wrong about the way in which power is exercised on them. And so if you think about contemporary reality, the contemporary world, you will have both climate change activists and you will have migration, anti-migration, far-right activists, both of which are trying to tell us something about the world in which they live, both of which are dissatisfied with the institutions that they are subjected to, both of which have a story of how the institutions got to where they are. And only some of these stories are compatible with what we have learned from the past, and others are going to be ruled out. And then there'll be still a variety of views that we can adjudicate, but the idea is that the method is what we use from a philosophical perspective in assessing the claims and the concerns and the commitments of the political agents that we encounter on the ground. And so in some ways, that means that philosophy, in asking the question of political progress, is problem-driven. It's driven by the problems of the world, it's driven by the problems of society, it's driven by the way in which we live. And the way in which we go about, as I say, has to take into account these real-world processes, and we need to evaluate who is making those claims, with what reasons, and what kind of stories do they have, both diagnostic, how did we get here, innovating, does the theory that this group is advancing contribute and preserve the benefits of rival theories and avoid the pitfalls, or does it take us to a previous stage of exclusion, of oppression, or a body of views that has been actually historically discredited? And this process is actually all historical and political in a way, and the philosopher can say very little other than having a methodology, a way of thinking about the world and a way of thinking about the problems. And it's also, the philosophical story is not going to be enough to prevent the emergence of these, what we might call normatively discredited views, so views that don't actually contribute to the normative refinement of to the functional refinement of the norms of justice. So one question might say, one concern that comes out of this account might be to say, well, why are we focusing on justice? Why is justice the value that we think about? And I think here, the reason we select justice as the relevant normative property and the lack of justice as the problem that is to be solved is not that we're kind of guided by an inherent passion for justice. We've just kind of picked justice and we say, that's the one that we need to track. I think the relation is dialectical in that the focus on justice reflects the kinds of focus that people have historically, the kind of claim that they have made on each other has been shaped by norms of justice. So when we think about the emergence of the modern state, or when we think about rules, when we think about the law as such, it seems that justice has historically played a crucial role in getting us to where we are now, where claims are always made as claims of right. So are you, think about the role of human rights, for example, but even less narrowly than just human rights understood as rights. Justice more broadly is the kind of normative property that enables us to adjudicate our relationship to each other by bringing certain concerns and by bringing certain categories of thought to bear on the real world. And that's to say power and authority and the justification of power and authority. So justice is the functional response to a background problem, and normative properties on my account are problem driven. And so they retain their relevance for as long as they respond to the problem, and they lose their relevance when they no longer form the basis from which we can look for this functional refinement. But although the functional refinement of norms is historically generated, it seems to me to be part of a cumulative process that tends to produce justified beliefs through a process of trial and failure and success. And this is how, to think about this, to make it a bit more concrete, you can think of it as reflective equilibrium, but in history. So rather than think about reflective equilibrium as a kind of thought experiment that just individuals do at a particular time, you think of it as an assessment of beliefs around institutions and around norms of justice that we can, that is informed by our reading of historical and political events, and also the intellectual history is connected to those historical and political events. So here, a principle or a combination of principles is desirable, as I said, if appealing to that orients the construction of institutions that perform better than competitors in responding to the concerns and the commitments of the agents that are subjected to power. And so a principle belongs to a family of theories that in some ways can diagnose more appropriately, can innovate over alternatives, and that has more heuristic potential. Okay, final 5 minutes. I'm going to just mention maybe some concerns and some criticisms that might be moved to this account, and then we'll perhaps develop it more in the Q&A. So I said, an interpretation of the function and purpose of political institutions should be sensitive to the historical process of functional refinement of particular norms. So the more these norms are intersubjectively endorsed by agents and reflected in the social and political institutions that they create, the more they are justified. The more they are justified, the greater their contribution to moral and political progress. The more political progress we make, the closer we are to knowing what is the right way of relating to each other from a political perspective. And that is gradually constructed through trial and failure and success. And that's why there is a kind of philosophy of history behind it, because you have history and you have this philosophical orientation with which you read history. Now, one of the objections is we don't know if a particular practice is progressive unless we know the direction of the movement. And we can only know if a particular direction is right or wrong if we have access to an independent standard that tells us where to go. So if we want to maintain that political progress is made by correcting the mistakes of the past rather than being able to foresee the future, we must be able to rely on actual historical practices as making an important contribution to that functional refinement, but then proceeding in that fallibilist way, which takes seriously what we learn from history, is basically raises another question, which is, what if the historical survival of a specific normative political outlook, how can it be sufficient evidence for its plausibility also from a normative perspective? So the fact that something's just survived historically isn't just in some ways what we could call the arrogance of the present. It's just at the present looking at the past and saying, well, this has survived and therefore this must be the one that has been that's the more plausible one. Now, I think here is where we mustn't go all empirical and contingent in a way. So this is where philosophy and this idea of intersubjective endorsement of norms plays an important role, because we could say that the function of justice is refined only if counterfactually successive generations are able to commit to the same system of rules, if all the counterfactuals around why they are contingently committed to that system of rules are gone. And so just to give you an example, imagine you have a society where you have norms of slavery. So you have power and coercive means that belong to people who are in higher ranks, and they make rules and exercise power on those who are in lower ranks. Now, you might say the people who are in lower ranks are dissatisfied, but epistemically, they might not have an alternative available to them. The question is, imagine that for whatever reasons, on natural catastrophe, war, enmity with neighbors, the society is challenged and then there is a crisis. At that point, the question is, would the subsequent society be viable from this intersubjective standpoint, even if we remove the counterfactuals that helped uphold the previous society in place? So would the next generation of members of that society continue to endorse deference to authority as the system of rules that is justified and that functionally refines over previous, more arbitrary ways of relating to each other? So if the body of norms that contributes to that functional refinement can be intersubjectively endorsed, and as I say, we run that philosophically, then we can say that the ethical code serves the process of functional refinement and the political code serves that process, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. So this test seems to place constraints on the conditions on the basis of which we can assess different interpretations of the function and purpose of particular institutions by using this method of trial, failure, and success to examine the solidity. Now, this argument raises another question, which is possibly more tricky, which is that it seems to give us only post-factum reconstructions of learning processes that we now have internalized, but it's unable to generate critical insights that are applicable to the future. So how can we generate prescriptions by just having an account of what was progressive and regressive in the past? So we look at slave societies and we say, well, that was obviously a regressive society. And insofar as we abolished slavery, that was a progressive refinement of the norms of justice. And so a system of rules that doesn't have these norms of slavery is clearly more progressive than a system of rules that does. So I think to answer that question, we have to, again, think about the relation between theory and practice in this old-fashioned dialectical way, which is we start with conflicts in society, and we think about the different agents in society that are responding to these conflicts, just like I mentioned earlier, kind of migration, anti-migration activists and climate change activists. And then we think about how are they reflecting on those conflicts? How do they diagnose them? How do they propose solutions that resolve these questions? And are they able to innovate over alternatives, or are they returning us to a period where these norms were clearly regressive and showed to be regressive? So I think in that case, we are oriented by practice, but not all practices will be functionally contributing to the refinement of the norms of justice. They will be the material for the scholars, for the philosophers, for intellectuals to reflect on society, but they won't be, the practices by themselves won't tell us anything about their normative plausibility. So the practices will only be relevant insofar as they reflect the learning that we have done about the future and the learning that we have done about the kinds of processes that are conducive to solving problems in the right way. And that means that we don't have to have the answer to a problem, but we have to have some sense of what is the right method of answering a problem. And so if we think that, say, democracy, decision-making, and if we think that reflecting on law and rule and rights in a certain way is more likely to give us the right outcome, then that method is the one that we will apply to then assess the potential contribution of these social movements on the ground to the question of are they regressive or progressive. So even at this stage, it's not that people will not disagree. So there will be a lot of disagreement, but I think the view or the method will enable us to rule out some instances of practice as clearly regressive. And then we can use the conversation around justice and around progress to reflect within the family of views that we think is progressive, to then have a further assessment of how do they diagnose, how do they innovate, how do they reflect heuristically about the future. So the instances of political practice will direct our attention to the kinds of problems that need to be solved. So they will tell us, this is what we need a diagnosis for, this kind of conflict. The theory will develop principles that contribute to the functional refinement of norms underpinning these practices. So that will be the innovation stage. And then the agency and the principles combined, and that's why it's a kind of revised philosophy of history, because this is exactly what authors who are interested in philosophy of history were trying to do, will give us a kind of dialectical account for thinking about how to change institutions in light with what we've learned from their institutions and from their performance in the past. And so the project is developed in dialogue with concerns of other agents on the ground. It's not just a kind of philosophical process that takes place in a philosophical lab. It's one that is informed by real world practices, but also doesn't let the practice do all the work, but the philosopher kind of goes back and keeps contributing with theory and insights about society. So one might say, okay, but by taking the history of political progress to help us make normative prescriptions on how we ought to relate to each other politically in the future, and how we ought to regulate the exercise of power for the future, aren't we committing the kind of naturalistic fallacy of deriving the ought from the is? And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but I want to clarify that it's actually not an ought that comes out from an is, it's an ought that comes out from another ought. These are all ought statements. These are all statements about how we ought to live together and what kind of rules we need to uphold and what kind of justice systems we have and whether the state as an institution enables us to resolve the kinds of conflicts that we have right now, or whether we have to think about institutions beyond the state. And all of these are ought type statements. So it's about how you get a more refined ought from a less refined ought rather than an ought from an is. And in some ways, it's irrelevant where the first ought comes from. I mean, I have my own answers, which come from Kant and so on. We can talk about that. But for purposes of this project, we can all have different stories of where this initial ought comes from. And then what we need to think about is how can these stories all come together to give us an account of politics and of the political institutions that we are shaped by and that exercise power over us in ways that can be conducive to these progressive refinements of justice. Okay, final sentence. So what did I say? That moral and political progress are centrally important to any account of human agency that is interested in the development of humans, but also in the transformative potential of humans. And although it's possible to reflect on both moral and political progress from a pragmatic point, what I tried to emphasize was a distinctive political perspective on that pragmatic understanding, on that sort of fallibilist problem-solving manner. And I try to defend the distinctiveness in terms of the functional refinement of norms of justice. And I mean, this was inevitably very general and very methodological in many ways. And we can only give them specific content by having specific conversations about specific political problems. So the philosopher doesn't really give you an answer to how to fix the world for once and for all, for everyone, everywhere. But what it gives you is the tools with which you can reflect on what you observe on the ground and on the kind of societies in which we all live, and think about that with this question of progress in mind, which, and both in a way with this question of progress as both a question that is fraught by this tradition that is dominating and oppressive and problematic and tragic in many ways, but also on the other hand with this idea that it's important, and it's an important question that we shouldn't give up asking and answering. Or trying to answer. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Uppi. And she's very kindly, Leah has very kindly agreed to take questions. So the floor is open. Just raise your hands. My eyesight isn't great, so just keep them up for a little while. Anybody like to get the ball rolling? Yep.
I think it's thank you for speaking. I was fascinated to mention slavery towards the end, but there are I'm thinking a lot about how the historians, the philosophy of historians, their philosophy is just to report on what happened, not to make any moral judgments on the exercise, not applying any normal or moral values that we carry in our society to the things that they're reporting on, for example, slavery.
Yeah, so my answer to this question has changed when I started doing actual historical work myself on archives as part of another project, another book that I'm working on, which is about family history and so on. And I started with this complete belief in facts, in historical facts. And I think this is what drives a lot of historians, is faith in the history of the facts and the fact that we can access those facts with just enough information and just enough research on the ground and so on. And then I discovered when I started doing my little project, which was a family history project, how these archives are just an interpretation. There are no facts there. There is no fact that is not an interpretation. So I think this belief that, and in fact, this is very anecdotal, but I started researching my grandmother, and I discovered that the people in Albania were spying on her, and so I started accessing the Secret Service files. And in Albania, where I come from, there's this huge discussion around accessing the truth of your family in the files and telling the truth and having a process of justice and reconciliation that is based on actually the truth of those files. And then I discovered that the people who were actually spying on her at some point got confused. And so the files I was reading were the files of two different people. One was my grandmother, and another one was a woman that had the exact name and surname, was born in the same city, came from the same family. And the people who were following her just made a mistake. And so, but for about a year, I read those files convinced that I was reading about my grandmother, until I realized that these were actually two in one. So this is just a small example to say that the historian's faith in the facts and the idea that we are accessing the facts without interpretation and without our values, well, even if it's without our own values, it will be the values of someone else. And the story is always told from some particular perspective. So we need to be able to engage that perspective and to deconstruct it, to criticize it, to think about it, to know which other perspectives were left out. And sometimes history won't have the voices that are actually oppressed. So we will have the history of the elites, we'll have the history of those who had an interest in telling the story from a particular perspective. And to be able to know what's ruled out, we have to have a story of progress in some ways. We have to have a story of victimhood and marginalization and oppression and reasons for oppression, of right and wrong, all these things. We are always having them, but we're not articulating them. And I guess my concern in this project is how can we articulate that in a way that doesn't itself reproduce, that is as clean as possible in not reproducing certain stereotypes and certain prejudices and certain assumptions that we all make about the time in which we live. But I don't think, and as I say this as someone who engaged with this process in a historian's capacity, who went completely, not as a philosopher, hands off from interpretation and just hoping that the files would tell me a story. And actually, I realized the files were telling me a lie. So what am I meant to do with that? And I think that's what we need to be able to say to the historians.
Hi, thanks very much. And it's not an area I particularly work in a lot, but it was reminding me, but it may be good or bad, that it reminds me that of McIntyre, sort of police justice, police rationality, because you're always engaging with some particular tradition that's solving problems through history. And then there's some engagement with other traditions being important and so on, but so I just wondered what the some salient differences that you might have in mind. And the one thing that seemed broadened at a crucial stage for you was the counterfactual considerations, but that then sort of immediately raises how broad the comparison class, that they could become very thin and abstract. It's usually, again, falling back into the resources of your own tradition and that claim the counterfactual.
Yeah, and I don't think I have all the answers to that, right. But I think it's, but I would say that my approach is slightly different from McIntyre in that it doesn't go in the radical contextualist direction. So whilst acknowledging that each of these are communities that have their own standards and different times and different places will have different ways of thinking about norms and norms of justice and so on, the effort also has to be what was the classical philosophical effort, which is to connect these things and to think about what do they have in common as well as what do they have that is different. And I think you're right, it may be that what they have in common is very thin, but that's still something that you can start working with. It may be that it's not as thin as we think, and that in fact there is more that we can say once we have a conversation that acknowledges that there is this commonality to begin with, and then will depend on what kind of theories and what kind of approaches one finds plausible. But I think my interest is in saying we can't close that conversation by just saying, well, you know, these incommunicable histories both in space and time, just like we can communicate in space with different cultures, because ultimately all of these different cultures have in many ways the same concerns. They respond to questions of justice and injustice and power and authority and oppression and rule and groups and so on, individuals and groups. I don't think that's the remit of just one kind of society or just one group. So that happens in space, but I think it also happens in time when we're thinking about history. There are, to some extent, also concerns that travel across time that we can bring out much more than we allow ourselves to, because we're concerned by this idea of, are we projecting too much about ourselves?
Roland?
Yeah, thank you. Very attractive idea to think of progress in terms of refinement and continuity. But just a very blunt question, what would you say to someone who didn't find that attractive?
wanted to blow the whole thing up.
Well, I mean, so I guess I'd want to know more, because there is a point at which, and there is a Kant scholar that I find very interesting, Lucien Goldman, who takes this question very seriously when he thinks about progress in Kant and so on. And at some point he uses this metaphor of the Pascal wager. He says, well, of course, you know, there is a story about reason that in some ways it's like the Pascal wager. So are you going with reason or are you going with unreason? And if someone jumps the unreason way, there's not really a whole lot that one can say. In a way, there is an alternative, very, very different alternative that comes from a very, very different position in the history of philosophy. That comes from Thrasymachos to Nietzsche, basically. And I just think I would then go back to my very limited pragmatism in a way and say, well, what are you going to do with that account when you think about the future? How is it actually going to be helpful? And then maybe there are versions of that objection that become more productive, but then when they become productive, I think they're also much closer to my story. And versions of it that just are going to not be productive because there's not a lot more than you can say after having blown the whole thing up. You're just left with the pieces. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated it at the end that you framed this as not an answer to the problem, but something of method. It can kind of help us evaluate progress from a political perspective. And one of the things we talked about repeatedly was the concerns and commitments of agents subject to political power. And in the framing, we discussed bringing in real-world examples, seeing what basically people are saying. So you've discussed different activist groups, right, who are calling for different things, whether it's anti-immigration or climate change. But in terms of climate change, a lot of people are pointing to the fact that the agents affected by political power are human agents. And those other agents also have concerns and commitments that are bound up in our faith as people who are living in that world. So how do you balance human and non-human concerns in evaluating political progress? And what do you do if non-human concerns are heavier or run counter to?
Yeah, so I think then it becomes a more empirical question. There are some of these non-human agents that are closer to human agents, in which case one can extend to them the framework with the appropriate accommodation, just like we make accommodation for children. You know, babies are human, but they're not human agents in the way in which a human agent that is an adult and fully formed and so on. But we still make accommodation for babies. You know, maybe we don't give them votes, but we give them a right to life, and we grant them certain claims, and we can connect those claims to the parents. And so somehow we relate them in this more scalar way to the concerns of human agents, and then we find ways of, so it's not an either or in a way. It's a more, it can be, I think, a more open. I would, however, say that there is something distinctive to moral agency, and that we are able to connect all these claims and to make these accommodations and so on, insofar as we have these moral criteria and defend these moral criteria. So I wouldn't be someone who says, well, you know, this bottle has rights. I relate to the bottle in certain ways. There are things that I can't do to the bottle, not just because of the bottle in itself, but also because what I signal to other human beings in terms of what I do to the bottle and what I do to our human relations and so on. But I think we have to preserve the difference between moral agency and other kinds of agency. And that doesn't mean that if we preserve and defend that difference, but that doesn't mean that we can do anything to these non-human agents. That would be my approach. Yeah.
That's your problem. Right. Maria.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I enjoyed the talk. I enjoyed a great deal and agreed with was that we were trying to move away from the contextualism of people like McIntyre and even worse, Rorty. So that was very welcome. But if I understood you correctly, it's intersubjective agreement have a huge role to play there. So and I can see that really we have not many other resources there, but intersubjective agreement itself started but also not always the best way forward, particularly since we know that very regressive values have had the consent of the populace.
Yeah. Yeah.
You said things about this, but I'd like you to give more explicit.
Yeah, and I think, so I was very torn about this until very recently, which is why I think the paper itself has that ambiguity. In some ways, I want to say, well, you know, it's agreements, and in some ways we have evidence of that agreement historically, and some institutions track that agreement. On the other hand, I'm completely aware of the fact that historical institutions are themselves the subject of power, and that they have survived for reasons that often have very little to do with agreement, which is why I said in the paper, I'm not all empirical about this, which is why history is philosophical history. The episodes, the kind of the reading that we give of these institutions, the examples that we cite as relevant, we don't cite them as relevant because they offer themselves to us as philosophically significant. It's because we made a methodological decision to single them out as philosophically significant. And so it's only those institutions that track philosophical agreement in a way that's slightly different from empirical agreement are salient from a philosophical perspective, but the process is back and forth because history also corrects us in many ways. And so
Can I ask one little figure? You know very well we have the problem of deep disagreement exactly about values among philosophers. So you know, philosophically, you're still coming up with that.
yeah, but I think so. I mean, we'd have to have a longer conversation around this. My sense is that we can agree on methods, and that's why I said I'm a Kantian. So it's the form is important there, and the content is then something that we can then develop in conversations that we need more practice to see how it develops and in what directions it goes. I don't think we have to have agreement on all values. I think we have to have an agreement on how we engage with the world in a way. What counts as a relevant method? What counts as the right way of thinking, of knowing, of thinking about morality? And I think on that we have actually, even across philosophical disciplines, we have a lot of agreement. It's just that we then cash it out in different ways. But the method of reason is there, and you know we start with that and then we can develop it further. I'd be really interested because if you have any more specific things, or if anyone has any more specific things to say about this, because this is actually the heart of the question in a way, and this dilemma that I'm always thinking dialectically about history and philosophy, that's exactly where it plays out. But my sense is that we can't really jump one way or another. We have to just keep adjusting, and that's why I insisted on valuabilism and the method that is flexible and learned from practices, because all we have to go by is this method that self-validates with the refinements of the methodological criteria.
I have three more people on my list. I have Ruth, I have Laura Jane, and I have Sylvia. Is there anybody else who wants to get in before we move to the more informal part? Yeah, okay, Attracta. Okay, so Ruth's the next.
Okay, thank you so much for a very rich presentation. I think you mentioned at various places that it's important to listen to the concerns of the people on the ground. And I would like to invite you to say a bit more on what work in like media and maybe social media in particular play in shaping the views and beliefs of kind of people on the ground or activists, and whether it would then be the role of philosophers to kind of also factor that in, or that has another dimension to the connector that you outlined.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And in a way, it's a question of propaganda and ideology. So is it everything that we are exposed to in some ways is just power and just propaganda and just ideology? But the good news, I think, from my perspective, is that sometimes ideologies are in conflict with each other. And in being in conflict with each other, they reveal cracks that then tell us something about, that give us some tools to then unmask the propaganda. So there is a sense in which this reflective equilibrium exercise that I was describing as historical, sometimes that can also take place when we assess the media and when we assess claims and when we think about the way in which ideologies play out. So yes, in some ways they are most of the things that we're exposed to are propaganda. There is always a point of view, often the point of view of the powerful and the privileged, but sometimes these points of view conflict. And so, you know, Elon Musk is not the same as some European political leader and so on. And the views are then help us or help someone who wants to think about this from a more impartial perspective, try and take the layers off. And I don't really know that there is a better or that there is a method that's more appropriate. There's not much more than we can do, really, I think, because that's always the case. And everything we have and everything we inherit has that problem to begin with, kind of the genesis.
Laura Jane.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was a fantastic presentation. And my question is more in terms of the concept of political progress. is related to, in fact, your own personal experience. Obviously, I have your own. That when you were talking about, of course, growing up in Albania, and of course the incredible sort of transformations that that small little nation had endured. And in particular, my question is basically more sort of about your own personal lived experience of that, because when we do think, of course, of how all norms, social and political, are intersubjectively constituted, communicated, and passed down to generations, when these sort of the big transition kind of came from moving from this, you know, way that, as you so wonderfully described in the book, by living and growing up and idolizing, you know, hugging the statue of Stalin in the beginning, and all of this, then realizing, well, hang on a second, all of a sudden these norms that you have lived, that have, you know, shaped and informed your whole way of being in the world, have all of a sudden been revealed to be, you know, sort of not as incredible as you were meant to be. So I would love to understand, or to hear a bit about how you actually experienced that transition, you yourself, there. What was that like?
Yeah, and that maybe by answering that question, maybe I'll say a little bit more also about my answer to the previous, would help me make more concrete my answer to the previous question, which was the question of ideology and propaganda. So, I mean, my entire childhood was shaped by a particular propaganda and by a particular ideological outlook on the world, including what I was told about the other world, so the capitalist world. And so the fact that, you know, there were children exploited in mines, and there was labor that was not fairly retributed, and there were these countries where there was these huge inequalities and so on. And in this moment of opening in 1990, the whole thing crumbled, including all the propaganda. Now, the problem or the good news, I don't know, in that propaganda, there was also some truth about these societies. And so it was very tricky when people made the transition from just getting rid of this system, what they retain from that system and what do they get rid of. So once you're told that everything is a lie, this was both in my personal case and in the kind of collective Albanian case, once you're told everything is a lie, then whose truth do you believe after? And of course, Albanians, you know, we were told that everything that came from the West was a lie, and everything they told us about capitalism was a lie, and now capitalism is the true system. But it turns out, actually, a lot of the problems that we were describing in children's books when I was a child about exploitation and child labor and so on, they are still the problems of capitalism. So in that ideology, in that spin, the textbooks or the way in which received wisdom operated in that system, in the insight that they were giving you about this alternative world, there was something that survived the collapse of ideology and propaganda, and something that, to me, remains accessible even when you get rid of that ideology, that you can kind of think and reason about it and discover that there are. So and this is it's why I say it's not, I don't have a philosophically elaborate answer to how you do that, but it's clear that something happens, and in those transitions, those are the moments where you actually, the veil is torn, and then you have to be really careful that you don't just go and dump for someone else's lie, thinking that that is the truth. And which is partly why I think all of history of philosophy is trying to tell truths and lies apart. And I think from Plato to Descartes and the evil genius and so on. But yeah, that's and for me, that moment remained formative, because in a way, once you've been lied to once and told that you've been lied to, it's actually really hard to believe again. And what made, and that's also why a lot of people that come from that part of the world and from that predicament have really lost faith, because the problem with being lied to is that since you can't believe, if you can't believe, you can't believe in anything, you know, reason, rationality, morality, you just don't believe in anything. And then you become really cynical and apathetic. And that's also not, you know, you go in the radical destruction route, and that's also not very constructive. So the question is, what do you hold on to? And I hold on to my method, but yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's in some ways it is a question of faith somehow. So
Sylvia?
So I don't know if I didn't get right, and I have four or five questions. I just joined two. Both from philosophy of science perspective. So when you were talking about progressive and regressive and feminist theory, of course, like Imre Lakatos came to my mind. Oh yes, good. So I was thinking whether you have explored the idea that political progress, we can also talk about like theoretical progressive and empirical progressive. I don't know if you have explored this, because it could be a message like understanding like the academic progress in progressive society and movement as well. And the second thing I would like to mention and ask is when you talk about criteria to compare and evaluate political theories to understand whether there is progress, and you talk about progress goals, right? So we see whether there is progress. And of course, Kuhn came to my mind. Yes, cognitive value is fantastic. But I was thinking, okay, so Kuhn and philosophers working in the traditional academic philosophers of science highlight that what counts as a problem also depends on theory, right? So what, paradigm do you like understanding the evolutionary function of like psychological mechanism makes sense in another paradigm doesn't have the problem. So I was thinking, do we have the same problem when it comes to understanding these types of dynamic and political progress or anything? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So yes, it all started in conversation with Lakatos and Kuhn, and exactly on this point of, where Lakatos departs from Kuhn in a way, in thinking about scientific revolutions and thinking about, okay, this normal versus extraordinary circumstances in scientific innovation. That was exactly my effort, was to try and think about something similar when I talked about diagnosis and innovation. So it comes actually, it's all informed by that whole debate, to which I'm very sympathetic. And in fact, it'd be interesting, as I was answering this last question about the function of revolution in my life and this whole ideology and propaganda, if there is an equivalent to scientific revolutions in social and political revolutions, and perhaps there is something that a revolution also does in that sense epistemically that is analogous to how scientific revolutions break paradigms. And of course, the problem is that in the case of science, we think that the rupture of a paradigm, when it works, leads to a higher truth. And I guess something like intersubjective validation is what I was hinting at when I said, these things, they have these norms that become increasingly robust if they satisfy these methodological criteria. And that leads us also to a process of somehow incremental and cumulative development that is analogous to having then this heritage that we all have that we rely on, which is science as a whole, I suppose. And that's where I guess, and so that's why I'd say, in response to the last question about the problem and the standpoint, yes, but that's where I would push back against, again, the kind of radical contextualist. Yes, there are standpoints that shape how we interpret the world, but there are also standpoints that we can agree on as being more plausible than those. So we can all agree that if I use reason and not power, that's a more plausible approach to solving a problem and to relating to a paradigm than if I just, go with whatever I read or whatever I see. So every standpoint is particular and flawed in many ways. But in assessing these different standpoints, we're using a meta standpoint somehow, which I think is the one that we're all deploying one way or another. Yeah, so that's where I think I'd go maybe a little bit away from the sort of radical feminist or the radical standpoint that says, only the standpoint of the concerned victim or of the concerned group is the one that sort of is informative for us.
Last question, at least last formal question here. You can have informal questions after a chapter.
Thank you very much for a very interesting paper. I wanted to ask about the question of the justice of borders and how your theory looks there. And there are many examples of issues, but since you're in Ireland, there's a border in this island, and there's a question about the ultimate fate of the border. And so, how do you deal with border questions on your account?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and in fact, it's the example that I at some point I didn't have time, so I didn't go into it too much. But I think it's a good example for how the paradigm, the positive paradigms that we live in fail us, because we take the state for granted just because the state is the site of justice, and we reify the state as the institution that delivers justice, and then we're unable to see that the states are actually themselves contributors to the problem. So I think the way I think about migration is the following, and that's why I was referring to these far-right anti-immigration groups. all these groups, whether they're in Albania, which is a country of emigration, or in Britain, which is a country of immigration, experience the same conflicts. They experience the same problems that have to do with climate change, with financial crisis, with general historical collapse of these models of development and so on. And they respond to these problems with different discourses. So if you're in Albania, where I come from, the response is everyone is corrupt, and that's why we have these problems. But of course, you change the elites and this problem replicates itself. So it clearly can't be about corruption. That shows the diagnosis is somehow failed. In other societies, so in rich societies, it's immigration. So we have too much pressure on the state, and we have to. Ultimately, I think the question, what enables us to resolve these conflicts, only if we say, okay, how are we diagnosing them, and which agents can we take for granted, which agents are now part of a progressive transition or a regressive transition. And it seems to me that the state at this juncture has become a kind of regressive institution, because it holds us back by making us believe that this is the site of norms of justice, and this is where the rules come from, and we have to accept that authority. But in fact, it contributes to the problem in that it doesn't see us that the world goes much beyond the state, and that in some ways, it's the conflicts that we experience can't be reduced to contributions of discrete states, but there's something that people have in common in terms of their problems, and they need to have frameworks for resolving these problems that are much wider than the ones that they have available and that these political groups claim to have available.
Thank you very much, Leah. That was really a wonderful, very generous set of responses to some very interesting questions. So before we give Leah the well-deserved round of applause, there's two things I want to say. The first is that shortly before this lecture, straight from the airport, Leah kindly and again generously agreed to do an interview for the School of Philosophy YouTube channel, and in duly edited form, that will be available in case you would like to listen to it later. Second thing is that you're all very, very warmly invited to have a glass of wine with us and with all of us on the 5th floor of this building, D5, the School of Philosophy, and I hope as many of you as possible will come along. So thank you very much, Leah, and I hope to see many of you later or immediately on D5.
No, it's fine.
They're good questions, and you really enjoy them very much. But good questions are always a sign that so we'll just gather our stuff. Yeah, okay. I'll take these.